Greetings everyone and welcome to this debate. So glad you could make it. First off, I wanted to thank the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, ISI, for sponsoring this event. Could not have done it without them. Briefly about them, if you are interested in holding events like this one, or bringing speakers to your campus, they are a great resource for you guys, so please, by all means, reach out. So my name is Daniel Tancredi, and I was the editor-in-chief of The Statesman until just a week ago. And that is a newspaper on Penn's campus that prides itself on objective reporting and passion in discourse. And if you're interested in joining as a writer or donating, please, by all means, reach out to me or talk to me after this event. Now on to the debate. I'll be introducing the mediator. Dr. Alan Charles Kors is the Henry Charles Lee Professor Emeritus of European History at the University of Pennsylvania, where he began teaching in 1968. He earned his bachelor's degree from Princeton University and his master's and doctoral degrees from Harvard University. He received postdoctoral fellowships from the American Council of Learned Studies, the Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton University, and the Smith Richardson Foundation. Professor Kors won 2 awards for distinguished college teaching and the Angelichev Award for Defense of American Freedom, and in 2008 he was awarded the Bradley Prize. Professor Kors co-founded and served as president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. As a member of the Council of the National Endowment for the Humanities and on the editorial boards of several scholarly journals.
As most of you already know, let me first apologize. I had dental surgery yesterday, so I'm hoping I'm comprehensible. I start with 2 strikes, nasal voice and Jersey City accent. Dental surgery gives me 3 strikes, but I'm counting on your kindness and empathy. As you all know full well, our friends on the left believe that they have the interesting debates and that they are the group with intellectual tolerance. To me, obviously, nothing could be further from the truth. And we will be looking tonight with 2 very distinguished people to speak to us about the libertarian and conservative divide within the freedom and rights movement. The schedule we'll follow is each speaker will have up to 10 minutes to present his view of the libertarian conservative debate, after which I will have a chance for 30-40 minutes to probe from those opening remarks and to ask questions if they've avoided difficult issues, which I doubt either ever does. And from 6:30 to 7, we will have 30 minutes of Q&A in which you may raise whatever questions you wish from politics, foreign policy, culture, higher education, as you wish. Let me introduce our participants this evening. First, and I use the name they use, it is Douglas, but for the world, Doug Bandow, who received his JD from Stanford Law School and who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, a libertarian, or if you prefer, classical liberal think tank. Doug Bandow is a prolific commentator and author whose articles have been published in a remarkably broad political spectrum of periodicals: Foreign Policy, Harper's, National Interest, National Review, The New Republic, Philadelphia's own Orbis, The American Spectator, Time, Newsweek, and Fortune. And in newspapers including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. He blogs for the Huffington Post, Forbes, and is a former columnist for antiwar.com. He has appeared as a commentator on ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox News Channel, and MSNBC. He is the author and co-author of, unless I've lost track of them, 10 books, writing on foreign policy, national defense, poverty, corruption, the role of the state, and religion. Rick Santorum, I have his permission not to have to say Doug and Senator, bias a debate a bit in terms of credentials. I didn't say it. Rick Santorum holds an MBA from the University of Pittsburgh's Joseph Katz Graduate School of Business and a law degree from Penn State University's Dickinson School of Law. He was a Republican congressman, twice elected by landslides in a heavily Democratic congressional district, and a two-term senator from Pennsylvania from 1995 to 2007. He was the chair of the Senate Republican Conference, the third highest Senate party position, and while in the Senate, he served on the Senate Agriculture Committee, Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, Special Committee on Aging, and the Senate Finance Committee, where he was chair of the Subcommittee on Social Security and Family Policy. He is the author of 4 books, plus there is an anthology of his speeches, so 5 books on themes of conservatism, politics, values, and family. His New York Times bestseller, It Takes a Family, was published by ISI, our host and sponsors this evening. A very frequent guest on radio and television talk shows across a broad political spectrum, Fox to CNN. He is currently a senior political commentator at CNN. And we shall proceed alphabetically with Doug Bandow.
Well, thanks. It's always a pleasure to appear with ISI. And I'm enjoying sharing the podium with Rick Santorum, somebody I've admired over the years despite our disagreements on some issues, somebody who's taken the trouble of jumping into the political process and trying to make a difference in a very often very difficult world. And ISI is a great sponsor. ISI is concerned about ideas, and this is certainly a time where I think we want to discuss ideas. You know, Washington is focused on the moment, on the immediate, on the power centers, and of course the power lines. But there really are some very important, larger issues, transcendent issues that we should debate. And I think especially as you all enter careers, these are issues we want to deal with. Well, the issue of conservatism and libertarianism has long been one of kind of mutual attraction and distaste. Both movements and philosophies have long been allied in many ways, but also in conflict. And I think some folks would view conservatism as the overall philosophy, and then they separate it into strands. You know, there might be libertarian, there might be kind of a more traditional, they might be a neoconservative. And clearly there's a lot of nuance when one discusses this in terms of where these go. I think the primary difference here, that what's focused, at least for libertarians, is the idea that liberty is the highest political objective. But I want to emphasize that that doesn't mean the highest human objective. I think there is a danger at times for some libertarians that, in a sense, libertarianism for them is a life philosophy. It's not for me. It's a political philosophy. The question is, you know, what is your highest life goal? It can be to serve God, it can be virtue, it can be a number of things. Liberty allows one to pursue that. So liberty is the political system within which one lives one's life. That, to my mind, then the political objective is to generally maximize the liberty that's available. Now that doesn't mean no constraints. Any kind of a system of sinful human beings is going to require constraints. To my mind, the focus of any political system is on what I would call interpersonal morality. Law should be based on morality, that's how we affect one another. That one should be extraordinarily hesitant to turn over to government what I would call intrapersonal morality, soul morality. That is an area where government tends to do, rather badly. I think in a large sense, the question is liberty good for us? Is liberty a good thing? Is liberty something that will promote, broadly speaking, human flourishing? And I think that in certain ways there's both a short and a long-term question. I think certainly in very important ways the answer has to be yes. At least if one looks at systems that submerge liberty, destroy liberty, that eliminate liberty, those systems, whether they go from kind of the soft core welfare state through the very hard totalitarian collectivist state, that in these systems, it's very hard to see human flourishing, very hard to see much positive. That lack of liberty is extraordinarily important. And I think that the challenge for us, of course, is where do you draw the line? Where are the limits? And I think a good reason to be skeptical of turning issues over to a collective in a political sense is that while being sinful, the sinfulness of humanity requires two things, really. One is it requires restraint. It requires control. Some of that's going to have to come from government. But at the same time, that very sinfulness makes it very dangerous to give government extraordinary power. If you mix the idea of original sin with the notion that Lord Acton was very famous for promoting, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, that one has to recognize the danger, and that's always the balance. That's the balance the founders talked about in the Federalist Papers. So I think that the challenge then is how do you maximize liberty and how far do you go? I think that this, why is liberty important? I think there are two aspects to this. One is a philosophical one. That ultimately, one sense of humanity is, while we have extraordinarily complex social institutions, including family, community, and others, the ultimate moral agent is the individual. I mean, in my view, the person, the agent that will stand before God in judgment is an individual. They will be called to account. So ultimately, most decisions should be placed at that individual level. It doesn't mean nothing else matters, but it means moral responsibility ultimately goes to that eternal soul that will be in judgment. And that is where I think it's important. If you actually believe in being made in the image of God, that those responsibilities for your family, for your own development, for worshiping God, for making all of these choices, ultimately have to be made at the individual level. And I think in a broader sense, there's a practical element that has extraordinarily important moral overtones, which are the benefits that typically come from a more liberal, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, liberal kind of, and in terms of liberty, order, in terms of the economic benefits and the others that come out of that kind of flourishing. The reality is that if one wants productivity, if one wants production, if one wants the goods that we take for granted, that those things typically only come out of a system based on economic liberty. And that doesn't mean that one's philosophy should be, whoever has the most toys wins. The point is consumerism has its own set of problems. Nevertheless, there's a hugely important aspect to this kind of production in terms of safety, in terms of health. You think of economic, you think of healthcare, you think of safety in terms of dealing with, say, typhoons. Why are the death rates in foreign countries so much higher? In terms of the quality of housing, the quality of infrastructure. All of these things, really come out of a productive, free, economic system. And the point is that kind of a system is always going to be a challenge because, as Schumpeter put it, capitalism is basically creative destruction. Capitalism gives us much, but things are destroyed along the way. And then the question is, how does one handle the hardship that comes out of it? And I think that is many ways, as we see kind of the Trump era, the question of the Republican administration, a lot of the economic issues, whether from trade and others, that is really the issue, which is recognizing that there are hardships that come out of a free economic system. How does one ensure that the benefits are widely shared? And that's something we may not have done nearly as well as we should have. And I think what we see not only in the United States, but also in Europe, many of the same phenomena, many of the same concerns, whether it be over trade and immigration, is that. It strikes me that is not an argument against freedom, not an argument against a free society or a more libertarian way of viewing policy, but rather it's an emphasis on looking beyond the purely economic. And for a libertarian, at least, when one thinks of a free society, it's far more than the economy. I mean, the economy is the economic engine, but to me, a free society is much more. I mean, to Tocqueville, going back a couple of hundred years, recognized that in the United States. The idea of social organizing outside of government. I mean, virtually all of us, and my guess is everyone in this room, grew up in a commune. That is a family. Very few families that I know of operate on economic principles. The point is, we have within a system of capitalism a whole set of institutions, churches, families, marriage, seminaries, and other things that operate on completely different principles. That freedom and liberty give space for all these alternatives. The challenge today, I think, is that we face people on the other side who want to close off that space. For whom diversity and liberty means something very different. For them, diversity means not, having a separate opinion. For them, liberty is a very different thing. And I think the challenge is how do we maintain that space for those who believe differently? And that's something that I think both conservatives and libertarians, in fact, would agree on. And there are obviously a lot of other issues there, and we're going to be talking about a lot of them as well. Libertarians themselves can be very divided on issues. Certainly one has a range of people. One could imagine a Milton Friedman is very different from a Murray Rothbard, very different from anarchists who are out there, very different from people, say, at my institute, where our view is we're trying to present liberty in a real world and try to come up with policy answers in Washington. And it strikes me that prudence is a very important virtue. The longer I've been involved in kind of politics and policy, I think that plays an extraordinarily important role. They're trying to design a system taking into account humanity's imperfections and recognizing that plays a role in designing institutions, and most importantly, allowing private institutions to flourish, recognizing the importance of experimentation among other institutions, lower levels of government, etc. One issue I just want to throw out, which I think is highly prudential, and I'm sure we'll get into as well, the question of foreign policy. Very often we look at libertarian conservative debate, I think, in three areas. One is economic, how a free market. The second is social policy. The third are kind of international issues. And to me, this is one where libertarians would argue that if you're defending a republic, that has to have an impact in terms of what kind of foreign policy that you have. And ultimately, your defense is of your own society. The highest priority of your government is to its own citizens. And then one should be very hesitant wandering around the world playing social engineering, leaving the politicians at home who are utterly incapable of transforming American society suddenly can leap overseas and turn other countries into wonderful America-loving democracies. That in fact trying to transcend religion, trying to transcend ethnicity, history, geography, repel these other things is well beyond their capabilities. It suggests that foreign policy should have a very large component of humility. And finally, on social policy, just very quickly, I think what's critically important is that liberty does not mean virtue is a problem. What liberty suggests is that one wants to be very skeptical, turning the job of virtue over to government. The government is not very good at solving it. And that the idea of turning that over and expecting it to turn people into better people, I think is something that history suggests doesn't work very well. And today we're paying the price. Creating institutions that promote virtue allows those who take control to promote things very different from virtue. And it's very hard to complain that if one has held the reins of government and tried to impose one's own views, it's very hard to argue against the other side once they have power trying to do the very same thing. But again, humility, caution, prudence are very important, I think, in limiting that role of government. Libertarians would argue that that's yet another reason for their general philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Doug. That was beautifully stated. And every time I listen to a libertarian give an argument for libertarianism, it just I feel like they sort of wrap themselves around conservatism. But I won't say it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Don't get me wrong on that. but it is not exactly the way that I don't see it, at least playing out as I have throughout the course of the public policy debates that I've been involved in. With a libertarian like Ron Paul, when I ran against Ron in the 2012 election, I've seen libertarianism play out a little differently than as described. I do, obviously at the heart of libertarianism is the word liberty. I think it is also at the heart of this country, and if you look at what conservatism is, I in my book, It Takes a Family, I used the definition of conservatism. I believe it's the best of Russell Kirk, which is, he describes conservatism as the stewardship of patrimony. What does that mean? That means that we are stewards of a great inheritance. And that inheritance is something that has evolved over time from the founding, that has certain values and principles that were based on truths, and that we have seen an evolvement of this country and of our public policy that is based on certain truths about human nature and humanity in general. And I always say I never thought as a conservative that I had an ideology. I never thought I was. People said, "Oh, you're a conservative ideologue." I don't think conservatism is an ideology. I do believe libertarian is, because it's what people want the world to be, not what it is, and then respond in kind to the different realities that we deal with. For example, the idea that we can base a society on individual liberty and individuals is a folly. Nobody builds a life as an individual. We are interdependent. And the most important interdependence, and I understand that libertarians talk about this, but they tend to just sort of put it over there in the corner with other things that are nice and somewhat essential in life. I don't believe that the basic unit of society is the individual. The basic unit of society is the family. So I wrote a book, It Takes a Family. I'm a Catholic. If you ask the Catholic Church what's the basic unit of society, they will not say the individual. They will say the family. Why? Because it is. It's just true. Nobody raises themselves. If they do raise themselves, they end up raising hell if they raise themselves. And so the idea that we have a family that nurtures and supports and educates and creates a moral atmosphere, if we don't have a government that understands the centrality of the family and that communal atmosphere that is atypical of libertarianism, then we find a society that does not have a good, strong moral core at its beginning, and so I really do respect the focus on liberty, and it is an essential element. It is to try to pursue the highest liberty, but to understand how you get there is two different ways. Nobody builds houses on individual grains of sand. You build it on something that is bound together, that creates a strong. Build it on triangles. You build it on things that are meant that are molded together to create strength. And that to me is what the family is. And so I always, and I did this in my book, but I believe conservatism in some respects has gotten away from this, is to understand how policies around, and this is a current debate. We saw it in the most recent tax bill that was legislated. It was a big fight about whether we were going to do anything to give a child tax credit or to do something to, promote marriage and things like that. And this was considered, anti-conservative because it's not pure growth economics. Doug made the point, and he made it right. But again, it's look at the policies as opposed to the language. That economic liberty, and I'm a very strong believer in economic liberty, but I also have to recognize, and again, Doug alluded to this, that make sure that the benefits are widely shared. The problem is, I don't know very many libertarians who actually do anything to make sure that happens. And if you look at the Wall Street Journal, for example, who I battle in on a regular basis, I mean, their focus is all that matters is the top line GDP number. Growth, 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 economic, that's all that matters. And if there is a problem with people, just grow the economy more. People will do better. Trade more. People get cheaper goods. The problem is we've seen now a whole vast swath of America that Donald Trump has tapped into that are not feeling like they're earning success in America. They're not feeling like they're participating in the American dream. I use the line in my book, and I use it a lot, is that John F. Kennedy said, talking about John F. Kennedy and the conservative versus libertarian debates, not necessarily appropriate, but anyway, he did say this. And we've appropriated this, which is a rising tide lifts all boats. That's absolutely true. Unless your boat has a hole in it. If your boat had a hole in it, a rising tide is a scary thing. It's also a thing that not only scares you because if you have low tide and you have a hole in your boat, you're sitting on the sand with everybody else. But when the tide rises, those boats are going up and you're sinking and you're in trouble. And you see everybody's boat going up and you're not. And so that dynamic is at play, and that's what we're seeing evidenced in America. And the idea that we can go on and say, well, we don't need to worry about the family as it is crumbling. Yeah, we have great economic. If you look at our economy is the envy of the world, and we're doing well economically and individual liberty and all those things. When it comes to economic freedom, we do pretty well. Not great. We're getting worse and worse on that. I agree with that. But the bottom line is, we do pretty well. But the reality is, our families are crumbling. We have depression rates at all-time highs. Suicide rates. You saw this the other day. Life expectancy for men in this country has gone down 2 years in a row. Why? Addiction, depression, and suicide. And we can say, well, families don't matter, and making sure that everybody feels an opportunity to participate and be connected to a vibrant and growing society doesn't matter, but it does matter. And it does matter about liberty, because the less people feel that opportunity is available to them, the more likely liberty is going to be constrained by those voters. Because they will vote for people who provide them security. So I completely agree with the emphasis on liberty. But I think we have to understand that we need the family, other media and institutions. I agree generally we should not be giving these things over to government, but nor should we be leaving them to the individual. Doug a couple of times said, that the libertarians understand the nature of man. I don't believe they do. I don't believe that a society, that libertarians that I know who want, on a personal and social side, rampant individual freedom, whether it's prostitution or drugs or abortion, that is an understanding of the nature of man. I have 7 kids. I know the nature of man. Okay? I've seen it. Okay? And if it wasn't for, my wife and me and our friends and neighbors and church and everything, our children would not be naturally good. And so the idea that giving it to government is the worst possible thing and leaving it to the individual is okay, I don't accept that. Not that I don't agree that government is problematic, but there is some middle ground here. And libertarians don't recognize that middle ground, and to the extent that I believe is important to a good and healthy society. On the final point, because Doug brought up foreign policy, I agree that foreign policy, we have seen some conservatives aggressively overstep on foreign policy. But the idea that the United States, as the world power that we are, should be less engaged in managing world affairs assumes that others will not replace us in that engagement. And that those others who do replace us will do things that are beneficial to the security of our country. And I simply have seen repeatedly that simply is not the case. And so as clumsy as we are, and I certainly agree with those who talk about how we should set up governments and do other things in other countries. I understand that the folks who do that are no better at doing it here in America than they are other places. But most of these other places are a far lot worse shape than America is. And as bad as we do it, it's better than most places would do it if we didn't get involved, and particularly if others got involved. With that, I'll be happy to take your questions.
I love the segue. I'll be glad to take questions since I'm the one who gets to ask questions now. We certainly will get to a foreign policy where I think the differences are significant. But given that we are at a university with a large number of undergraduate and graduate students here, let's start seeing about what differences or points of convergence there are in thinking about the culture and nature of higher education. As you both know, debates on college campuses now rage over issues of hate speech and the First Amendment. over what is and what is not sexual harassment, sexual assault, and appropriate due process for the accused on issues of sexuality and gender. I'd be interested to know what are the issues in these university campus debates that most interest, appall, or please you. I'd be interested to know your views on the culture of higher education today. Doug?
Well, it strikes me that higher education, other than some instances like Hillsdale or Grove City College and other places, I mean, universities have become very much captured by the left. Whether you want to call it a Marxist left or whatever, we can argue about labels, but it's certainly a very intolerant left. I mean, I was very lucky in law school, even going to a very liberal place, Stanford. My professors on the left were genuine liberals. I mean, I was very visible. I wrote for the Stanford paper. I was in student government. No one had any question of my views, and I never worried about being graded down. I was very visible in a lot of ways. I don't think we have that today. And I think it's frightening because there really is, I think, sustained assault. One is on, I mean, private universities aren't technically subject to the Constitution, but the whole question about due process and things that are extraordinarily important in the sexual harassment debate. I mean, what's gone on is horrible, and I think men have, in many ways been blind to how pervasive the problems have been. Nevertheless, to essentially treat people as guilty, I mean, it's something really runs against the entire sense of what the judicial process is like. And the question of ideas, I mean, that we really live in a world now. Look, I go to an evangelical church. I respect Catholicism. I have friends, I mean, our church has a mixture of people, including Catholics. So I've been very involved in this debate. My first book was one on religion and politics. So I'm very concerned about religious liberty. And I think what we see is an extraordinary assault. I have to admit, I was taken by surprise. I thought that the safeguards were stronger, the cultural support was stronger, but the whole gay marriage has been used as a battering ram against anybody who happens to believe differently. And I think it's scary. That's where suddenly we find you cannot even speak. I mean, ideas have become toxic. Ideas are now treated as if they're violence. I think it's hugely important. I mean, I think a lot of students don't accept all this stuff, but it certainly has an impact. I mean, these are the institutions that are shaping intellectual America. And you start thinking about that change over time and what does it mean. Lawyers are being trained in law schools where these kinds of concepts are being taught. What does that mean for the law in the future? What does that mean for constitutional interpretation? Judges, the president's been appointing some very good judges, but the long term. So I think these are very frightening things. I think these are issues that matter for both libertarians and conservatives. That if one's thinking about the future of the culture, one's thinking about the future of liberty, one's thinking about respect for genuine diversity and due process, that all of these things are under siege. To me, it's scary.
Can I get you to touch on the hate speech, free speech?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think what's extraordinary, actually, I was at an event earlier today, and one of the people commented about how it took Donald Trump to get Democrats to get mad at Russia, and Democrats now think the CIA and FBI are wonderful, and he really went down this wonderful list. I mean, in 1984, Ted Kennedy was sending messages to the Soviets wanting to work together to show that Reagan was a warmonger. I mean, it's lunatic stuff, because all that's gone now, and Russia's now a great enemy. And what we're seeing, people on the left who want, I mean, the joke is, the American Civil Liberties Union has all these projects, and some even, liberals, folks on the left have said they now need to have a civil liberties project because they become very political. In many ways, the ACLU looks like any other left-wing group. And I could respect them in the past, even when I disagreed on issues. Today, I see virtually no support for liberty anywhere. And I think that's the question on the hate speech. Hate speech has become the exception to swallow the rule. Where now freedom of speech is not allowed because if you insult somebody. But yeah, some people say some odious things. On the other hand, they get to define what that is, and we all know certain things, what is going to be hateful and what won't. We know whose views are going to be judged. I think that's extraordinarily problematic, and I mean, the work you've done and others have done, fighting that on campus is extraordinarily important. It's why we need to have good constitutional jurisprudence, we are very lucky to have a First Amendment. Canada, European countries, I mean, these are places you give a speech, or you give a sermon, you can end up being accused of hate speech. They've had cases, Australia, Canada, Britain, and others. This is very bad stuff, and it's moving in the wrong way, and I think it's very hard to know how to stop it.
Well, I would agree with everything that Doug said on that microphone. There's no weakness. Okay.
We don't want to use this
That's
one.
on. Green light's on. Test.
Sure. Why don't you use it?
So I agree with everything that Doug said. I mean, I'm just curious. How many of you believe you've been graded down for your political beliefs? Raise your hand if you think you've been graded down. Not that many. Or you're shy. But we'll make sure the camera's not on them if they do.
Or
So.
they're choosing their courses wisely.
Well, that could be true. I mean, I guess you might find out what your professor. Yeah, I just there's not much I can add, but just let me say this: that in a book that takes a family, I talked about how the left has sort of taken over many of the media institutions in our society, and we're sort of down to. I mean, it started with the university, and then the reality is that just about every segment of society, Hollywood, the news media, the universities, primary and secondary education, some of these are government, some of these not. Big business is now very much of the left, and so the only thing that's left, and we're seeing this has been the assault over the past 20 years that I wrote about in advance of a lot of the things happening when I wrote the book in 2004, published in 2005, was the family of the church. That's it. That was the only quarter for the values that were conservative and in nature. And of course, in the last 25 years, what has the left tried to do? They have systematically tried to destroy the family by redefining the family out of existence, and they're hugely successful. And look, there's a pure political aim to this. I mean, just look at people who are married and how they vote, and people who are not married and how they vote. I mean, it's simple. I mean, Republicans win the married vote. Even in the last election, we won the married vote. I mean, Mitt Romney, we lost to Barack Obama. 62% of married people voted for Mitt Romney, but single people don't. So if you're a political party, it's pretty easy. Why would you want to promote marriage? You lose if you promote marriage. Why? For the very reasons I stood up there. Is it because of the indoctrination of values, and indoctrination in a good way, of values and morals and principles and the security and the safety? This is the essential element of the family. It provides stability and security. And if you're out there on your own, if that's your vision, then you're looking for someone to provide you that little bit of security. Who is that? It's the government. And so it's much easier to see that view of the world of government being more engaged and involved in everything you do, because you don't have anything else that replaces it. And so understanding that the left understands that, and you'll go up and they'll say all the right things, but and libertarians say all the right things, but they don't do anything to help the family because they don't think it's their business. And I think that's dangerous. I think that's wrong. Same thing with the church. I won't say that as much with libertarians with respect to the church, but the reality is that we are seeing, as Doug said, an assault on religious liberty. I actually did a movie, worked on a movie called One Generation Away. It's probably like 3 or 4 years old now, but still very much worth seeing. It's a documentary on religious liberty, and the reality is that we have never seen an assault like this in our country's history. Everybody says, there's no problems. You guys are exaggerating the circumstance. Yeah, it's not as bad as Doug says it is in Canada, where preachers can get thrown in jail for hate speech, or in other countries that don't have a First Amendment. But look, here on college campuses, they don't want a First Amendment. And where did all this start? I must be a killer of microphones or something. Every one of these movements that we've seen all start here. They start on college campuses, and then they propagate themselves out from here. Why? Because you lead the country. They indoctrinate you, the future leaders of the country, and then you go into the corporate boardroom and you accept these left-wing policies because that's what you know. Or at least you're comfortable with, even if you don't agree with it. You can say, I understand everybody feels that way. Well, everybody doesn't feel that way, but the elites do, and you're part of it. One of the reasons I love coming to college campuses is because it's vitally important for you to hear some other point of view than what you're being indoctrinated with. And you are being indoctrinated. You say, well, I'm in a conservative group, and no, you're still being indoctrinated. Because everybody you know thinks not like you do, so you feel a little different. And so when you get out in the business world, that's gonna be hard, because now you're working not just about your grades, you're working about your own economic success and the viability of your thoughts and belief structures in that system. You're gonna be intimidated. It happens every day in the corporate boardroom and in the executive offices and everything else. And it's gonna happen to you unless you have the courage that the other side has. They didn't care if they got thrown out because 20 years ago they were for gay marriage. They continued to fight. They didn't care because they knew if they fought, they would win, and they do. And what we do, as people on the right, is even when we don't lose, even when we're winning, we give up. Because we don't want to fight. And that's fine.
Given the agreement on catastrophic consequences of having these closed shop, politically orthodox universities, and I must say that the transition here at the University of Pennsylvania from when I started in 1968, when I retired in 2016, was enormous. It went from an open-minded to a closed shop campus with no political dissent conceivably being hired in departments in the social sciences or the humanities. Given that there's general agreement on the nature of the problem, there is also, from a policy perspective and the issue of governmental action, an enormous transfer of wealth every year from taxpayers, working families, working students and individuals, to this educational system that is the gatekeeper to the rewards, material rewards that society has to offer. In terms of costs that are forever being met by increases in state and federal subsidies, the college loan debt, given what's happening in higher education, what would you do in terms of governmental and state policies?
First thing I would do has nothing to do with government. And I'm talking to you, for those of you in the future, because very few of you are in this position right now. But here's what I would say. Don't give money to your college, ever. Ever. Don't do it. If you're a donor, if you're a conservative, and you give money to your college or university, unless it's, and I'll give you a list of them, because it's easy to write a list of. Doug talked about two of them. But there aren't very many. But if your alma mater, good old Princeton or whatever, Penn or stop it. Stop it. You're killing us. You're giving money to the enemy, and then you're wondering why they're shooting us. Because you give them the bullets. So that's number one. Number two, it is no surprise the left's biggest focus is, we just need to have everybody go to college. Well, of course. It's like Rick Santorum said, I want everybody to go to church. And we're going to give you money to go to church. You'd say, well, you can't do that. You can't do that. You're going to indoctrinate people. Yes. That's what we do. We indoctrinate them. And we also put them in huge debt. And we make them more dependent upon the government when we do that. This is really bad policy. But of course you go out and say, we're going to cut back student loans, we're going to cut back student grants, we're going to stop, people aren't going to be able to go. No. Because for every dollar we add to student loans and student grants, they just increase the amount of tuition and room and board, and it's this ridiculous cycle. Stop it. This is, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. We do the same thing over and over. We keep increasing aid, and guess what? They keep increasing the cost, and everybody, and the guy that gets hurt is you and the taxpayer.
Well, I think one wants to be very selective in who one supports. I mean, alternative universities that offer, a different kind of a program, whether it's St. John's or Hillsdale, Grove City. I mean, there's some out there, but it's a fairly small number. But they deserve support.
Absolutely.
Hillsdale. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. At Hillsdale, Grove City, for example, working, they don't even want you to take federal loans because the moment you take federal loans, the feds show up and say, guess what? We get to regulate you. It's extraordinary. I mean, the reach, the feds, never ends. And certainly there are other universities you might be selective. I do a lot of Federalist Society talks, law school talks. And it's very interesting. Some of the universities, chapters find the administration is genuinely illiberal in the sense of they're very happy to have people in. They like the fact Federalist Society likes debates. They're supportive. But there are an awful lot of administrations that are unremittingly hostile. I go to law schools where none of the left-wing faculty will debate. They will not appear on a program with a Federalist Society speaker. And one should take that into account. You have people, as Rick points out, they turn over huge amounts of money. And same with foundations, frankly, where we've seen foundations set up by capitalists who made their money in a free market, who these things are taken over by the left and suddenly become battering rams of ideology for a whole host of issues across the spectrum. And I think it's right. The point is economics tells you throw money at a system, what's going to happen? Prices rise. I mean, universities understand more money is available, they charge you more. And the problem is then you owe money, you owe the loans. I mean, far better to have lower prices and less loans than to have them raise the prices and you have to take out loans to pay it. And of course, that has two aspects. One of which is you have a huge loan you have to pay back. And I mean, for a lot of students coming out in a less certain job market, that's a huge burden. But second is, it's financially devastating. I mean, one of the big overhangs, we have over $1 trillion of student loans, many of which are, ultimately will have to be written off. It's yet more being, the U.S. is effectively bankrupt. We have $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And student loans is just yet another one of these things that is passed and thrown on and thrown on. And I think we need to work at some level trying to change the social expectation. It's great if you want to go to college, but don't think you have to go to college to have a fulfilling life. People do extraordinarily wonderful things without going to college. People go, go to college and get, they kind of waste their time. They feel they have to be there as opposed to other things they might really be better at and would prefer to do. But we denigrate other things, in terms of, well, if that's not college, it's not white collar or whatnot. Well, in fact, it's a great way to live a very fulfilling life, and you have so much more than just the job you're getting out of college in terms of family and everything else. And that's a social expectation that I think we need to work on and try to change that. And the focus of any kind of governmental aid should be for needy students, not a generalized subsidy, and it needs to be carefully controlled because the current system is for colleges. It is not for students. It's a subsidy for universities, for professors, for all of that, the industry, as opposed to subsidies for students.
I just mentioned one other thing. You talked about foundations. Just about every single foundation that is out there was started by a conservative. And all of them are now, almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them are now left. One of the things I proposed when I was out there is to put a time limit on how long a foundation can exist. Because eventually they're going to go to seed. And so you just make them spend their money. And I suggested 25 years, it's negotiable. But after 25 years, they have to spend their money. You make them spend so much of their corpus every year, and eventually they have to get rid of it.
It was clear in your opening presentations that there is a libertarian conservative divide on issues of foreign policy, national defense that we should explore more. Choose all three or one, but the debates I hear most now are about what should be a sane and sound U.S. foreign policy toward Europe and NATO, toward Russia, and toward China. I think the audience would be extremely interested in your views of what keeps us safe, secure, and in a world in which hope is possible.
It's his turn to go first.
There we are.
Well, I'd say underlying the whole issue of defense, national security, a couple of principles, one of which is defense of the United States is paramount, but is defense of the United States. Allies are a means, not an end. You know, we shouldn't go around the world picking up allies like people pick up Facebook friends. Great. Montenegro and Macedonia, members of NATO, great behemoths that will fight off the Russians. I mean, you know, this is the, you know, you read the book The Mouse That Roared. This is the Duchy of Grand Fenwick. We're turning them into allies that now have a say in terms of what NATO does. It's an insane policy. Second is that foreign, basically security and defense subsidies, commitments, deployments, all of that stuff is not charity. It's security for America. So the notion that one helps out other countries because one feels sorry for them is not a particularly good basis for foreign policy. Third is that circumstances change over time. Foreign policy should reflect circumstances. That what was required during the Cold War, when we did face what Ronald Reagan, I think, accurately called an evil empire, is not the same as today. That the world is vastly different. The evil empire is gone and the allies are rich. That suggests your foreign policy should change. Finally, it's very important, I think we do this very wrong in Washington very often, is recognize that military spending is the price of your foreign policy. So an argument over military spending without thinking about foreign policy makes no sense. It's very dangerous, in fact. If one simply wants to cut back military spending but does not change any commitments, it's extraordinarily dangerous. My nephew's a SEAL. I mean, if you're going to send David out, I want to make sure he has the materiel, the manpower behind him. So the last thing you want to do is cut military spending, but still want to do everything you can in the world. If you want to run the world, it will cost you a lot of money. That's the reality. So I think that what we face today is what can a bankrupt republic do? And is the American people ultimately prepared to give up Social Security and Medicare so they can subsidize European allies who can't be bothered to spend on their own defense? This is going to put extraordinary pressure on U.S. military spending in coming years. I think we need to debate foreign policy now and decide on trade-offs. And my guess is the American people will prefer to be worried about themselves very fundamentally in this regard as opposed to subsidize everybody else. So let me say, to me, NATO's easy. The Europeans have 10 times the GDP of Russia, 3 times the population. It's time they defend themselves. The Germans spend 1.2% of GDP on the military. They obviously don't feel there's a threat. Fine. Don't expect us to do it. If you can't be bothered, Italy and Spain have large economies and they spend less than 1%. The Brits get to 2% only because they cheat. The French aren't at 2%. The Baltic countries and Poland tell us they're worried. They spend the maximum of 2%. I mean, if you're really worried, you should actually have a strong territorial defense and make it clear. Anybody who plays with us is going to pay a high price. It's time for the Europeans to take this over. It just is. Russia's a nasty, Putin's a nasty guy, but Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's not an ideological opponent. It's a decaying power. I think that it's basically pre-1914. It wants border security. It wants us to respect their interests. It'll play with us, but he doesn't want war. He'd lose. He's not interested in global domination. He's an ugly character, but he's certainly one the Europeans can handle. I think China's the potential threat in the future. The point is our policy today is pushing Russia towards China, which is, again, an insane policy. The Russians have a lot of reasons to be nervous about the Chinese, but we have a policy that's actually encouraging them to cooperate. That's a bad idea. What we want on China is we want our allies to do a lot more. I mean, the problem is they all want to borrow our Navy. So the Philippines wants us to protect Spratly Island, or the Scarborough Reef. Well, they don't have their own Navy. Their flagship of the Philippine Navy is a 50-year-old Coast Guard cast-off from us. Well, if you want to play with the Chinese, you better do a little bit more. The good news is that Japan's starting to do more, that India is playing a role, even the Philippines and others want Japan to do more. I think the question there is how do you get your allies to do more, and the way you get them to do more is not promise to do everything for them. The worst thing about subsidies, kind of commitments is you basically discourage your allies from doing more. And it's time that they do so. If they feel threatened, they've got to do more. And I would consider very kind of unorthodox measures. For example, maybe it would be good if South Korea and Japan had nuclear weapons. If you want to contain, and deter China, are we really prepared ultimately to risk Los Angeles for Taipei? I think these are issues we need to debate because China is going to be the big challenge. A lot of bad is going on there right now internally. Doesn't mean necessarily a big military threat, but a lot of bad things are going on there. How do we deal with that in the future? Countries in the region have got to do a lot more.
Okay, what percentage of our GDP do we spend, of our budget, excuse me, do we spend on the military? Daniel, give me a number. 18%. Students, what do you think? Come on, give me a number. 50. 50? 15? Okay, it's about 11 or 12%. Okay? It's 11 or 12% of our budget. Do you know what it was in the height of the Cold War in 1960? 50. So everybody says, oh, we're spending all this money on defense. No, we're not. We're not, relative to what we spend on everything else. I mean, if the most important job of the federal government, and I think libertarians and conservatives would agree, the most important job of the federal government is to keep us safe from international threats. I think everyone would agree to that. Democrats don't, but I think libertarians and conservatives do. And we only spend 11% on it. So when I hear calls for spending less money, I think it's misplaced. The other number two, why do the folks who have the most ability to be able to provide for their defense don't do it? Because we didn't want them to. Okay? We didn't want Germany to arm. We didn't want Japan to arm. We didn't want them to have a military. We didn't want them to have an... Why? Because this goes back to sort of the nature of things. For a long time in this country, after World War II, we said, you know, we really don't trust these people as a country, as a culture, to be militarily powerful. Because bad things can happen. Now, we may have changed our mind. We may think that the nature of things have changed, and that isn't going to be a threat in the future. We make that decision. We should make it based upon a discussion as to whether we actually think that's a good idea, not they aren't paying their fair share. I agree they're not paying their fair share. But that was a deliberate plan that they didn't, right? And so, if you look at what's going on in Germany and some of the political movements within Germany, there's maybe some reason for concern as to whether Germany should be a really powerful military again. Is that more of a threat than Russia? I don't know. But the idea, and I support Trump. I agree with him that they should meet their 2% commitment. I would have no problem with upping it to 3 or 4%. But the idea that the United States, it's not in our security interest, or they should be doing a whole lot more and we should be doing a whole lot less. I think that just ignores a lot of. We're going to get into another huge war, not because of something that happens in the Asian subcontinent. We're going to get into a huge war if something happens in Europe, because we just are, because we always have and we always will. And so this alliance is a very critical alliance, even though Russia may be a paper tiger. Maybe they were like they were in 1914, but I'll tell you what, a Cossack running at me and a nuke running at me are two different things. And the Russians may be pathetic with their economy, and they may not have a whole lot to show for themselves, but they got something that can change the entire planet in a heartbeat. And you cannot ignore that. And you can't ignore the fact that Vladimir Putin sees himself as a modern-day czar. And the reality of not just the nuke, but the other means of attack. And that is cyber. So you talk about evil, and I talked about the evil empire. We have evil empires now. North Korea, oh yeah, we worry about their nuclear weapons. I worry about their viruses. I worry about a whole bunch of other things from Moldova. Okay? And a lot of other places who could do a lot of harm to this country, Iran, etc. So there are serious issues here that we have to spend resources to protect ourselves. I couldn't agree more with Doug when he says that the principal purpose, in fact, I would almost argue the sole purpose of our military is the national security of our country, and should be with respect to foreign policy. But that doesn't necessarily dictate an insular view of how we defend ourselves, walls and borders, as opposed to aggressive action to cut off potential problems before they reach our shores.
You do the last word, and then we turn to
Sure.
you for questions.
I mean, first, the GDP number actually doesn't tell you much because the real GDP
Percentage of the
today,
budget, not GDP.
the real GDP today is about a dozen times what it was in the 50s.
No, it's not a GDP number.
but the
It's a percentage of the budget.
But we spend more today than we did during the Cold War. And the question is, are we actually more in danger? Yes, no. In real terms, we do. Get a copy of the federal budget. And we spend more today than we did during the Cold War. And the question is, are we more endangered during the Cold War? I have trouble imagining that. Two is, we've been telling the Europeans for years and years and years they should spend more. I have trouble seeing how the Germans are going to launch a new war where they don't want to spend any money on the military. They're having extraordinary resistance there. They like relying on the U.S. The problem is, it's like domestic welfare. If you take care of somebody else, why on earth should they spend money? The Europeans are doing exactly what is logical. They don't have to. They know we will whine about it. They'll never take it on. I think what's critical here is to recognize that alliances can be transmission belts of war rather than fire breaks to war. And that's the danger in a place like Europe. The problem is, to the extent you will allow other countries to borrow your military, you encourage them to be more reckless and to do less on their own. You're more likely to find yourself into a war. We can say, I think, at some point, other countries really are responsible for themselves. And this is a case with Europe. They've graduated. The good news is that the Cold War worked, America's defense shield. They don't need it anymore. Change the policy along with circumstances.
There is no microphone out there, so ask loudly. There is a microphone. Perfect. Ask, and let's find out what questions are on your mind.
Thank you very much.
So you both talked about the unit of society, individual versus the family, and I just wanted to know what the both of you think in terms of, I understand like maybe having policies to encourage people getting married and building a family together, but how do you think the government or as a society we should address individuals who are raised in a broken home?
Well, I'm not too sure I understand what you mean, policies to address children raised in a broken home. So, for example, one of the things that I've gotten a lot of heat from conservatives in the last few weeks, as I wrote an op-ed in National Review talking about the need for a paid family leave policy. Now, the paid family leave policy that I think is appropriate would be an individual-based one, not an employer mandate or anything like that. But frankly, I think the ideas that several Republicans have floated using the Social Security system and advancing Social Security benefits to pay for that. Why? He said, well, mom, the broken home, doesn't have no dad in the home. That mom would be eligible to take, say 8 weeks, maybe more, maybe 12. I don't know what the benefit would be. That's to be negotiated. But take time off. Why? Because there is a host of social science evidence. It's not even negotiable anymore. That children who don't bond with their mother or father end up with a multitude of problems throughout their life. I mean, it's just they have insecurity, instability, mental issues, physiological. That bonding of a child, that feeling of safety and security and stability at that very early age is an absolutely essential part of a stable life. And if that's not available because mom is having to go back to work because she has no other means of support and she can't stay home, she doesn't have family because she comes from a broken home also, then we have a variety of different caregivers and we have serious issues with respect to the raising that child. So to me, this is, you say, well, the government has no business stepping in. Well, the government already stepped in. The government already stepped in and society stepped in and destroyed the family. And so the question is, do we sit on the sideline and say, well, it's gotta naturally heal itself? Or do we have to do some things to remedy the situation? And one of the debates, for example, is going to be, are we going to provide paternity benefits?
my answer is yes, but only for married fathers, not for unmarried fathers. Why? Because I don't want to encourage unmarried fathers. And you provide benefits for unmarried fathers, you're encouraging the same kind of behavior that gets you in the problem even more down the road. So there are all these issues. Now, that's one example of a specific policy to address that issue. There are a lot of others. But they have to focus on, and I talk about this a lot in my book, how do we get back to lowering the divorce rate, lowering the out-of-wedlock birth rate? And a lot of it has to do with our churches and our educational institutions and our civic institutions, all of which are dying. And your generation is putting the knife in their back. Your generation is the least faithful, the least you not joiners. You don't join anything other than, Facebook groups. But you don't actually physically join anything or do anything. And the culture is making it really, really hard. And so you can say, well, we need to let the private sector fix this problem. And I would agree that would be the optimal way to do it. Right now, I'm not seeing how that's happening.
Well, I think that the challenge here is you're dealing with extraordinarily difficult social problems and is trying to figure out how you insert yourself and how public policy can help, I think is extraordinarily challenging. In my view, as the family is the basic social unit, I think the individual is a basic political unit. So there's, and again, who is the moral actor that will be judged? I think it's individuals making choices. I think the social unit is the family, and I think it makes a lot of sense to want to preserve that and to support that. I mean, the question of, for example, regulatory and tax policies that make it hard to have somebody take care of a family on a single income. I mean, joining that is also social expectations. I mean, it's very hard, to control that, but I think it matters to the extent that if one believes that one should consume at a higher level, then one feels pressure to enter the job market and change one's lifestyle. So you may have two out earning when you could have had one. I mean, so these are intertwined, but certainly trying to look at that. The question of, and it's been addressed to some degree, but it's not entirely satisfied, is the whole question of welfare, the impact on family formation. I mean, Charles Murray, back 30 years ago, Losing Ground, I think extraordinarily important, pointing out that to the extent you effectively subsidize failing to finish school, illegitimacy, marital breakup, not just marital breakup, but the lack of formation, which was really the transformation that we saw at that time. And the feds were effective, not intentionally, but were effectively subsidizing that. That's extraordinarily problematic. So I think that's where, the first do no harm strikes me as being a very important factor here, kind of a principle that one should use. Yeah, and I think, we've had our discussions before about trying to have, for example, marriage. You have the second kind of a tougher marriage you can enter into to try to hold people together. I mean, there are a lot, these become very difficult issues, but the whole impact of no-fault divorce. You don't want to force people to stay together in very awful circumstances. On the other hand, you worry about making it so easy of breakup that, a marriage that might have been saved. One of the policies that I think is helpful, the earned income tax credit, for example, is it provides money to people who are working. In my view, minimum wage is a mistake. Among other things, minimum wage, most of the benefits go to second and third earners. They don't go to primary earners. And they put people out of work. The point is, if you raise the cost of labor, people hire less. The EITC is a mechanism to put money into the hands of those who are working. We're doing exactly what you want, which is working. So I think we can look at those sorts of things, but ultimately a lot of these things move in ways that we don't control. Look at illegitimacy rates. It's not clear to me that, it come down, I think, in recent years. I mean, these things move in ways that ultimately what's most important, and I think Rick is right, a dissolution of social institutions makes it hard to kind of replicate the values and to promote an ethic there, that this moral and social infrastructure and kind of environment within which we operate is almost invisible, but it's extraordinarily important.
Questions? Yes?
Oh, yeah. So for those who are on the right,
Sorry, can we get a microphone?
over here.
Whoever has the mic, get up here and.
Okay. Oh, do you want to go first?
Oh, you're next.
Up
Do you
here.
have a question?
Oh, you.
Oh,
You have a question, but we'll go after.
Do you have a question?
okay, no, if you have the mic to ask a question, ask him,
Okay.
and he'll go next.
Okay, hello. Thank you for coming this evening. I have a question about big technology and censorship in regards to hate speech and free speech, as you were talking about before. So do you think that there should be some sort of government intrusion into big technology in regards to algorithms and so on and so forth, trying to kind of alter the way that speech is presented online, not just the speech itself? And then if so, how do you think we should go about, quote unquote, breaking up a conservative allegiance to a free market in that nature, because it would be government intrusion?
I guess I'm very skeptical to think we're going to get a better result turning that kind of... I mean, we have problems now with Facebook and Twitter and others. I mean, they clearly have different standards in terms of what they view as hate speech, what they view as beyond the pale, who they're not going to allow on their platforms. I don't know how one tries to dig into that. I mean, we once had the fairness doctrine that applied to broadcast. And it was one of the reasons why Sunday mornings you'd get these, utterly boring shows, the local county commissioner talking about all the good stuff they were doing, because this is part of the requirements they had for broadcasting. And the idea was you had to kind of give equal time to both sides. I mean, all of these things had a lot of unintended consequences, didn't seem to work very well, and I think we were probably better off getting rid of all of that stuff. So the idea of loosing the federal government on Facebook, and is that likely to get us a better result? Well, what happens when the next president is, I don't know, Beto O'Rourke, whoever, right? I mean, whoever the flavor of the month is, on the left, Bernie Sanders or whatever, and then they appoint their people to the regulatory agencies. My frustration with the Bush era was, powers were granted in the name of anti-terrorism. My view always was, are the people handing these powers over prepared to have Hillary Clinton exercise these very same powers? Now, if the answer is no, don't give the power over. I mean, we have to recognize this is, and you look at education in schools, I mean, all the things we've been talking about, it goes down to the elementary in terms of social attitudes and all these things. The other side gains control of these mechanisms that once we might have thought had some positive social impacts, and use them for their own ends.
Government and social media.
Yeah, I'm gonna side with Doug on this one. I have real concerns about the government getting involved in this area. As someone who has been the victim of a lot of bad attacks and social media, and had my issue with Google for a long time, and they've decided they can clean up things for liberals who get bad things said about them, but when it comes to conservatives now, it's free speech, and we can't mess around with our algorithms. So, I've dealt with this for 15 years. And I can't imagine the government would make it any better. This really, again, it comes back to you. I mean, you're consuming this. You're feeding the beast. So it's just your own habits, your own, what you do participates. You're all on all of these social media platforms. You know how bad they are, and yet you're still on all those social media platforms as bad as they are. And you don't say, no, I'm not going to support this. You say, well, I cut off from this. Well, there's alternative ways. People survived before without participating in some of these clearly, in my opinion, fraudulent communication platforms. So, or develop a new one. I mean, most of these places, most of these social platforms have alternative networks that you can use them, and develop your own. Work with a company that shares your values. And I think we don't do that. The left would never, ever, ever participate on a platform that was hostile to them. They simply wouldn't do it. Or they would cause holy hell until they changed. We don't. We assume that we're going to be the minority and we're going to be criticized, and we just live with it. We just accept it. We take it. I mean, we're all battered spouses. We are. And you don't even know it. And you come up here and say, well, maybe the government can help you. No offense, I didn't mean to make fun of your question. But that's what maybe the government can help us, or maybe the government. Grow up. Quit. Start your own. You're from Penn, you're smart. Create a new system. Do something. Quit participating in their game. And complain about somebody doing something about it. You're somebody.
The quit, I like it. Reminds me of me of the old Bob Newhart psychiatrist routine, where someone comes in, I'm always attracted to the wrong people who hurt me. And he says, stop that! Quit! Indeed. Sir.
Hi, my name's Corey. I'm a freshman at Penn, and an issue that I think has been really thorny for conservatives recently has been healthcare. And the argument that the left always seems to give is that the services, of a healthcare provider are necessary, and I think that's valid. We need medication to stay alive. We need the services of healthcare providers, and their solution is always more government. But we've seen that the government isn't really capable of providing reliable, high-quality healthcare. So, how do you think that we sort of counter that argument? Because I know Milton Friedman said, well, the government could just give everyone a universal basic income and then people would buy their own insurance. But I don't think that's something, Republicans got rid of that idea a while ago. How do you think we could make private insurance work and really counter those arguments that, because it's a service that everyone needs, the government is really the only one who can ensure that people get it?
Yeah, this is, I lose this. Hello? I killed another one. It is working. Hello? Hello? It is working? Okay. Now I hear it. Okay, now it's working. So, this is the gift of being a Democrat. The gift of being a Democrat is you only have to learn one answer for every problem. And it's the same answer. So it is really easy to be a lefty because your answer is take money from rich people and spread it out with a government program to those who need fill in the blank. Education, healthcare, whatever. It's the same answer. It's always the same answer. The problem with our answer is we have the same answer and it's always complex. And so we are required to actually know something about these areas and actually have solutions that can work in the real world. The problem is communicating those. I mean, this election was a perfect example. The Democrats ran an election on pre-existing condition. Do you realize how few people prior to Obamacare were affected by the, quote, pre-existing condition clauses in insurance? Almost every state banned them already. Everybody who had employer-provided insurance, if you lost your insurance and you went to get another, you couldn't be written off. There was such a small percentage before Obamacare, and no Republican. Donald Trump ran for president. He said, "I'm not going to eliminate pre-existing." That doesn't matter. They're going to go out and lie, and because it's simple, they want to scare people. So the answer to your question is, I can give you, I've spent the last year and a half with a healthcare working group trying to develop healthcare policy, and I can give you a really strong answer, and you wouldn't understand most of what I'm talking about. Because it's how we structure the private marketplace in order for it to be efficient and providing the kind of insurance, because we're talking about insurance at affordable rates to people who are not chronically ill and high users of health. And we've developed a really cool system that gets money out to the states, that allows for innovation, but requires people to take the sick people and provide money for them so we actually pay for the sick people. And then everybody else in the insurance market gets to have a competitively priced product because you're dealing with basically a relatively healthy population. So you get low-cost insurance when you're talking about a relatively healthy population. So that's a quick answer, but and there are ways we can do that, but that's never going to sell to the voting public because that doesn't mean anything. How does that affect me? So what you got to do is you have to actually come up with talking points. This is the problem of America today, is that the people we're talking to don't understand most of the issues we're talking about. Particularly these complex issues. And so the Democrats have figured out lie about things that poll well, and Republicans have to figure out telling the truth about things that poll well, because we're not going to lie. And there are some things that we can do, but it's not at the core of what health reform is. I mean, because that just simply doesn't sell. I mean, it's really sad, but it's true.
I think there are a couple of problems here. The first is, I think Rick's right, this is a very complex issue. it's very easy to say we will give you health care. It's quite different to try to explain how the system works and what actually would provide health care. The second is I think that people, broadly speaking, on the right, lost an opportunity that they should have taken after the collapse of Clinton care, which was to address the problems in the system. I think that is a great victory. We can kind of go, isn't this fabulous? Let's go on to other things, and I think that was a huge mistake. The reality is we do not have a market system. And it's an illusion, and the right should never have defended the existing system as if it was a market system. I mean, half the money that goes into the system is governmental. And 90% of people, payments for health care originally come from somebody else. That is third-party payment. I mean, you ultimately pay through insurance or whatnot. But the point is, your health care comes, you pay 10% of the cost directly. So imagine any other aspect of your life. You could walk into an auto dealership, point to a car, write a check for 10% of the price. Would that change the car you? Now, I have a Toyota Camry. I can assure you, if that was the system, I'd have a Porsche in my driveway. If I can give 90% of the cost to somebody else, thank you very much, I'll get my dream car. Or imagine if you had restaurants that operated on this. You pay a monthly premium and you walk into the grocery store or the restaurant, you choose your food. Well, I think steak looks pretty good today, and how about lobster tomorrow? I mean, then imagine, well, then they're going to say this isn't working, so they're going to put utilization controls on. So now you have to go and call up the headquarters in, Minneapolis to see, have you reached your allotment for the month in lobster? I mean, we created this weird bureaucratic system, among other things, because of the tax preference, which came out of World War II and had no logic to it other than the fact there were wage controls, but there were not controls over fringe benefits. People use the fringe benefits to attract workers, is that we've moved to employer-provided. Now, this is an idiotic system. You lose your job and you lose your health insurance. What could be more stupid? You're at your most vulnerable moment and you lose your health insurance. You don't lose your auto insurance, you don't lose your homeowner's insurance, you don't lose your life insurance. So the point, and these are incentives that have had natural impacts that we needed to have done. And it's kind of hard to do so, but there's a whole bunch of things. But the real issue, I think, is how do you take care of poor people and people who are uninsurable? High-risk pools, but you have to fund them. For people who are uninsurable, states would do that, but they never wanted to spend the money. Something like Medicaid, but I think you should structure it differently. But again, you have to be prepared to pay the money. It's expensive. We give people third-rate. We promise them benefits. Doctors don't want to take them. They go to emergency rooms. It's a real mess. So the stuff we can do. It's a conversation we did have, but as Rick indicated, it's a very hard one to have in this political climate.
Let me just make one more comment. So, there's been some good things that came out of Obamacare that he didn't intend. Nobody intends. Most people think it's good. Number one, deductibles have gone up and copays have gone up. This, which gets to Doug's point, which is people are actually now paying more out of pocket for their health care. They don't like it. They don't like it because they, for some reason or other, they're willing to pay for to get their car fixed or whatever, but they don't want to pay for the thing that's the most important thing for them, which is their health, which is really sort of counterintuitive, but that's the system that we have. One of the things that I introduced way back when was health savings accounts. So you folks get out of college and you're starting your own, you're getting your own insurance, get a health savings account.
My institute has them. Thank you very much for that.
I introduced those back with John Kasich, who's since left the fold, but John Kasich, hi John, we introduced it back in 1991. We eventually got them passed in the late 90s and got them expanded under Bush. But Doug's point is also great. Republicans are to blame for this because we've had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to fix this problem, and we never did because of conservatives. I'm one. Dick Armey and I introduced the bill back in the mid-90s for a tax credit for the uninsured. Basically saying, let's just provide a tax credit so everybody can have access to buy insurance. You have to spend it on insurance, but everybody, why? Because we give huge tax benefits to people who work for employers. We give them huge tax benefits with employer-provided coverage, but if you don't work for an employer that provides coverage, you get nothing. How's that fair? And so it was obvious, it was easy, but we didn't want to spend the money. And we end up with Obamacare. So shame on us. So a lot of times, this is, we have folks who just are very short-sighted when it comes to, look, we we are a republic, and we have to listen to what the people of our country want. And the people of our country don't want people without insurance. They don't. And if we don't deal with this problem in a way that makes sense from a financial point of view for the government, and that creates a good system of quality health care and access and affordability and all these types of things and efficiency, then we're going to get Bernie care. And that's the thing that drives me crazy, is our lack of effort is the reason we have the problems that we have.
We have time for one last question.
So we, as in college-age students, seem to be the victims of this vicious cycle where we're encouraged to go to school, and from there we want the one-up, so we go on to grad school, and we spend all these years getting an education, and then we're expected to get internships, and then we realize that we're in debt, we need to find a job. We spend time finding a job, we finally get one, and we spend a number of years working on building our careers and building ourselves as individuals. And then by the time we're in our late 20s, early 30s, we're now considering a family, and that has a huge effect on the whole family values thing. And I'm wondering what we can do as leaders among our peers at this age who are looking to start a family soon. What can we do to lead as an example to ensure that people don't get too caught up in these individual ideas and focus more on family values and family tradition?
Well, I mean, capitalism is wonderful. It kind of creates a market for everything, but that doesn't mean there should be a market for everything. You know, that kind of what there should be markets for is only going to come from outside. And I think these kind of issues is going to come from outside. I mean, it's one of the worries about the loss of some of these other institutions, and churches is clearly one in terms of decline of many churches, that those kind of values need to come from outside. I mean, I do think that even from the secular world, well, if we need to affirm people who make other choices. The affirmation should not be, oh, the only route to take is to income, go ahead, your career is everything, it's all that matters. I mean, I remember just being appalled. At some point it seemed like this whole idea of the trophy wife took off. You know, and there was a time, I think, that other executives would be horrified if you showed up after you dumped your wife of 25 years and showed up with some sweet young thing. Well, then, I mean, now it's Fortune magazine that's doing, kind of cover stories on executives who are showing their success. I mean, this needs to be a social attitude. Emmanuel Macron, president of France, recently said, why would any intelligent woman want to have a lot of kids? Well, my pastor and his wife, Melanie, have 9 kids, and more than you, right? And, I mean, all these kids are extraordinary. I mean, one of them's actually out in Hollywood, kind of the Christian underground out there. And Melanie is very accomplished. With the kids out of the home, she teaches. She's written Christian romantic novels based on C.S. Lewis. She lectures in Great Britain on C.S. Lewis. I mean, Melanie's an extraordinarily accomplished, and her husband's wonderful too. But Melanie is a very accomplished person who did, and now they have gobs of grandkids. I spent Thanksgiving with them, as I always do. So we need to affirm that, and that's something. We need to say that that's fine. That's good. That there's something going on there that affirms the transcendent, the important. I mean, politics consumes my life, and it's horrible because there's so much more important out there. And I think we need to do anything that we can to affirm that, encourage people in that regard.
Nowadays, when you finish your undergrad and you decide to get engaged at 24, 23 years old, however old it is, by our peers, that's frowned upon. Like, if we see someone who graduated a year before us, oh my gosh, they're already pregnant, and we look at it like they're jeopardizing their future, which is, if you think about the root of it, they're trying to do better for themselves and create a family. And so how do we change that stigma?
Well, I mean, you can. That's affirm. I mean, that it goes back to the same thing. I mean, this is an opportunity for you to understand, and I mean, the fact you asked this question, I'm sure to some people, what you're saying is actually appalling to them, even in this room. But it shouldn't be. Even if you don't agree with it, you shouldn't condemn people who make that choice. Because, by the way, it's actually a really smart choice. It's a smart choice on a lot of levels. Number one, there was a great article in the Wall Street Journal, I don't know if you saw it, Doug, it was several months ago, by a woman, a Harvard somebody, who wrote about the best chance to find an actual mate that's probably the best mate for you is in college and shortly thereafter. And it gets so much harder once you move on. Why? Because people live their lives and screw up a lot the older they get. And they got all sorts of issues that you're going to have to deal with now that you're 30 or 32 or 35. And it just and just the pool goes down. So you know where do you want to go? Where you have if marriage is important to you at some point, then why don't you want to marry at the time that the best chance to get someone who's good to marry? Number one. So that's just the odds, folks. I mean, it just makes sense. It's a rational choice. Number one. Number two, I can't tell you the number of people I know who have fertility problems. I can't tell you. You're young. You probably don't know that many. I know a lot. And of kids and friends of kids, and kids of friends. And the reality is, the older you get, the harder it is for you to get pregnant and have children. And that happens, it's happening over and over and over and over again. The most fertile time for a man and woman is in their 20s. That's just the truth. Okay? And you say, well, you know, well, I have other things to do. Ladies, life expectancy for you is 82 years. Okay? You can have 3 careers. My mom turned 100 last month. Okay? Thank you. She told me she was going to stop driving on her birthday. And the reason, I said, why are you stopping driving? She said, because if I get in an accident now, they'll blame me whether it's my fault or not because I'm 100. Okay? Look, you've got years and years to do careers and things and pursue things when your kids are gone and you're still healthy. And you're wiser and you'll do better at your careers. You're going to do much better at your career because you'll have learned so much of raising children and doing the things that you do in your life. And then now you're 45 years old, your kids are all out of school, and you got a good 20-year career, a 30-year career ahead of you, actually doing good things instead of working as some flunky out of college. Just think. Don't accept the reality of what the left tells you you're supposed to do. I'm not saying everybody should do this. Just for clear, I'm not saying everybody should do this. But I'm saying it's not a wrong thing to do. And it's something, again, back to Doug's point, that we can't go out and beat up on people for diversity, for tolerance. How about tolerance of people who actually want to do really smart things with their lives? When it comes to having children at a time, like the other thing, I have a 10-year-old. I'm 60 years old. You know how hard it is to have a 10-year-old when you're 60 years old? It is hard. Young children are physically demanding, right? And so I can tell you, you get old fast. And so having kids when you're young is really great because you can physically deal with the physical demand of the children that you're going to have.
ISI, from its beginning, has sought to keep alive on college campuses and available to minds of students everywhere, alternative perspectives, debate, dissidence from prevailing campus orthodoxies. Much of the libertarian conservative divide can be replicated in some of the history of ISI. Just for historical fact, its original name was the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists, the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. But at an individual level now, with extraordinary ramifications for society writ large, it appeals to that love of dialogue, debate, disagreement, and civil discussion of serious things that universities are increasingly failing to provide their students. Thank you to the participants, thank you to ISI, and thank you to all of you for being here.